endless history of Yale football. From the father of the game itself, Walter Camp, to Coach Carm Koza today, Yale has played a leading role in the development of this great sport. We've dug into the past. We've found rare film of great Yale football moments and have interviewed many of the greatest players who have honored the Yale tradition.
Talk great players. Mike Pyle, that certainly includes you. And I feel in a way that we're preaching to the already converted because most of you understand the specialness of Yale football. But we need to stress Yale football has always stood for excellence at that concept of amateur participation in competition. Student athletes, that concept has never wavered. And then we talk about Yale music. I remember the first time I heard Bulldog, Bulldog, Bow Wow Wow, I said, huh, are you kidding? But that music and all the other aspects of Yale music have special meaning to any of us who have ever played Yale football and will continue to have enduring meaning for any future Eli who tries to maintain the proud tradition of Yale football.
The tradition of academic excellence began in 1701 when a charter was granted to establish a school in Brantford, Connecticut. The school was moved to its present New Haven campus in 1716, taking the name of its benefactor, Elihu Yale. Yale's reputation grew through the passing years and generations of students. Once an all-male school, now co-educational. Leadership in all fields, from business to politics to the cultural arts, is a Yale hallmark, and so is athletic achievement.
In almost every way, Yale stands at the head of the intercollegiate football class. As a matter of fact, Michigan and Notre Dame learned the game from us. After a 1914 28-0 Yale victory, Knute Rockne said the Elis made his Fighting Irish look like a high school team. Through 1991, after 120 years of competition, Yale had won more games than any other school, 766 victories and counting. Mike, that first victory came against Columbia in 1872. Back then they called it football, but it was more like faceball because I think they kicked each other more than the ball.
Tim, that was the only game in that first season, and it was more like a barroom brawl, 20 men to a side. Whatever it took to win was the rule, punching, gouging, kicking, even using non-student ringers to help their side. There weren't too many rules in those days.
In 1878, a Yale medical student named Walter Camp took charge not only of his team but of an entire sport. It was a good thing he was a medical student because he could be team doctor as well as the coach. Camp is called the father of football, and with good reason. He wrote the basic rules of the game. He popularized it. He cleaned it up from a brawl to a legitimate sport. For the next 47 years, Walter Camp literally ran football through his leadership and innovation. He crafted his first significant rules in 1880, limiting participation to 11 players a side.
In 1881, Camp created the system of downs. 3 tries to make only 5 yards. It was the standard for 25 years when Tim had evolved into what you and I know, 10 yards and 4 downs.
But that field doesn't look like anything we knew, Mike. It was amazing. To enforce that rule, Camp lined off the field in 5-yard sections, creating what was known as the gridiron. Camp's original grid, in fact, looked like a checkerboard. Then in 1883, Camp gave the game its numerical point system that would evolve into the present value. Touchdowns the predominant weight, 6 points. In 1888, Camp passed the rule allowing tackling below the waist. Before 1888, students like Captain Ray Tompkins coached the football team. Then Walter Camp, who ironically left medical school because he couldn't stand the sight of blood, became Yale's first non-playing coach, in this case without salary. Camp's 1888 team won all 13 games, outscoring their opponents 698-0. That same year, Camp showed a flair for publicity, publicizing the game he created by starting a tradition that lives to this day, the All-American. Camp personally selected the All-American team until his death.
Over the years, Yale has had 81 All-Americans, second only to Notre Dame. Camp's first All-Americans in 1888 were Amos Alonzo Stagg and freshman Pudge Heffelfinger. Stagg, who went west in 1892 for a 40-year career as coach of the University of Chicago, invented the huddle, numbering of players, and countless formations.
Camp and Yale had led the way for years with new rules, new formations, and new equipment, including the tackling dummy. Legendary coach Knute Rockne was obviously a big Yale fan because when he was asked where he came up with the famous Notre Dame shift, Knute reputedly said, "I got it where everything else in football comes from, Yale."
But the great warrior of Camp's first team was America's first true football star, Pudge Heffelfinger. Walter William Heffelfinger came to New Haven from Minneapolis. He was a giant for his time at 6'2", 190 pounds. Pudge led Yale to 54 wins against only 2 losses. And he was the first man in the game's history to pull out from his position at guard and lead the runner downfield.
Pudge Heffelfinger became the first All-American 3 years in a row. And after Yale, Heffelfinger became the first professional football player over 100 years ago. Pudge played pro and semi-pro football long after his Yale days were over. He hung up his gear for good in 1933 at, get this, the age of 65.
How Yale got its mascot is another story. It happened in 1889 when a Yale student named Andrew Graves made the ordinary purchase of a tough-looking bulldog from a local blacksmith. Graves described the dog as a cross between an alligator and a horned toad. He scrubbed the dog down and named him Handsome Dan. Noting that he barked whenever Yale scored, as if on cue, the delighted Yaleys named Dan the official team mascot. Handsome Dan the 13th has defended his Eli since 1984. Walter Camp stepped down as coach after the 1892 season with a record of 67 wins and only 2 losses. But he continued to supervise all sports at Yale as athletic chairman. Camp's immediate successors sustained his spirit of excellence as the Elis won 115 games, going unbeaten 6 times between 1891 and 1900. 52 of those wins came between 1891 and 1894.
The unquestioned star of that era was Frank Hinkie. Hinkie was a small man indeed, a 150-pound defensive end. But he was such a hard-nosed player and vicious tackler that he became known by the nickname the Disembodied Spirit for the way that he slashed through ball carriers. Hinkie was the game's first 4-time All-American. By the turn of the 20th century, college football was being played from coast to coast. College football had become the recognizable symbol of autumn leisure, and Yale was the unparalleled leader of the sport. So much so that the word Yale in association with college football had become almost synonymous.
This film, shot by Thomas Edison's Vitagraph Company in 1903, is the earliest known sports competition footage. It was taken at a rare Yale loss, 11-6 at Princeton, near the Edison Labs in New Jersey.
Yale football not only was being seen in the Nickelodeons, it was celebrated in the popular literature of the day. The dime novel gave universal exposure to a fictional Yale student named Dink Stover. Then author Bert L. Standish outdid Stover with the athletic exploits of another Eli, heroic Frank Merriwell, a wholesome, upright young man who pulled out victory after victory against all odds, many of them in the closing seconds, all for the glory and honor of Yale.
But all was not well with football. Yale alum George Woodruff, coaching Penn in the 1890s, created probably the greatest monster ever known to the game, the flying wedge, a formation so dangerous that, Tim, its existence actually threatened the game itself.
Mike, defending against the flying wedge was a real nightmare. It was sort of like facing a human bulldozer. So many players were seriously injured or even killed, President Teddy Roosevelt had to intervene. TR summoned Camp and other football leaders to the White House to make the changes that would save the game. They formed a National Collegiate Athletic Association to oversee the sport. They abolished all mass formations, including the flying wedge, of course, and they went much further. Only academically eligible students could play on the varsity, and at that time for just 3 years as undergraduates only. That ended a practice of using so-called ringers and non-students to represent schools.
Yale was leading in the forefront of another college football staple, the fight song. Bula Bula was first played and sung at the Harvard game of 1900.
The late Cole Porter is famed as perhaps America's greatest composer of popular music. While still a Yale undergraduate, Porter showed hints of his musical future with the Bingo Song. Then he added to his musical legacy to Yale with Bulldog. In 1909, the Elis, under Yale's first paid coach, Howard Jones, had 6 All-Americans, led by captain and fullback Ted Coy. They outscored their 10 opponents 209-0.
Frank Hinkey, the great All-America of the Flying Wedge era, returned as coach in 1914, in time for the opening of the largest football stadium in the world at that time, the Yale Bowl. Built for football, no running track, the Bowl has 71,000 unobstructed seats, each with a back for spectator comfort. Harvard spoiled the dedication ceremony, unfortunately, winning 36-0 to leave the 1914 Elis at 7-2.
It got worse for Yale and Hinkey in 1915 when Harvard routed the Elis again to finish a 4-5 season, the first losing year in Yale history. Hinkey was fired in favor of Howard Jones' brother, Tad. The 1916 Tad Jones Elis restored the winning tradition as Joe Neville scored to give the Bulldogs a 6-3 win over Harvard and go 8-1, an auspicious start for the Tad Jones era.
All games came to an abrupt end 3 games into the 1917 season due to America's entry into World War I. When Jones returned in 1920, another glorious era was underway. He was blessed with many fine players, among them a superb all-around athlete named Charlie O'Hearn.
Well, Tad was a very inspirational leader. The 21 team was his first good one. That was our sophomore year. He had the nucleus of our freshman team, which was an exceptionally good team.
Yale has had 4 unbeaten, untied teams in the 20th century. 1905, 1909, 1923, and Mike's team in 1960. There were other close calls. For instance, 1921. The Mal Aldrich-led Elis of 1921 beat Army 14-7 at the Bowl, but fell short in the season finale when they were tripped up by Harvard 10-3.
Everything came together for Yale in 1923. The line was anchored by All-Americans Century Milstead and Ted Blair. The captain was fullback Bill Mallory.
Yale was 6-0 by the last home game at the Bowl with Princeton. The Bulldogs wore down the Tigers, pulling away to win 27-0 to set up the big showdown at Harvard Stadium. Tad Jones had his team ready, but the elements took control.
It poured for 2 or 3 days before and continued for 2 or 3 days and poured all during the game. That was the one the Ducky Pond picked up a fumble and ran 50 yards through the mud, and then Bill Mallory, who didn't kick field goals when I was there because Mac Aldrich and I did the drop kicking, and Mallory practiced field goals, and he kicked 2 field goals in that Harvard-Yale game, which on top of Ducky's fumble run for a touchdown was the total score of the game. It couldn't be a high-score game because of the weather.
The 13-0 win completed 1923's unbeaten season, locking up a national championship for Yale by one of the rating services. Tad Jones finished his coaching career with a flourish in 1927. Yale lost only once, 14-10, to Georgia.
Despite that loss to Georgia, Yale shared the national title with Illinois and Notre Dame, sealing it in the season closer, a 14-0 victory at Harvard. It was a fitting finale for the coaching decade of a true Yale hero, Tad Jones.
Yale's successes in the 20s were tempered by the passing of the father of football. Walter Camp died in March of 1925, a nationwide fundraising drive going to the construction of the Walter Camp Memorial Gateway to honor the single greatest contributor to the success of football.
To the tables down at Maurice, to the place where Louis dwells, to the dear old Temple Bar we love so well, sing the Whiffenpoofs assembled, with their glasses raised on high.
Maury's. Maury's has been a place for pre- and post-game fun since the beginning of Yale football. Louis Lindner, in other words Louis, gave Maury's its fame in 1909 when he invited a group called the University Quartet with a fifth voice to meet there every Monday night, raise a stein or two and sing for their supper. Soon that group became the Whiffenpoofs. As the tabletops are filled with the Whiffenpoofs' carved initials, they are removed from active service and hung on the walls of the club.
Depression grabbed America hard and held on tight. Yet Eli football prospered thanks to the presence of three fabulous athletes who caught the nation's fancy.
First was a little man with giant abilities and an equally huge heart who became a Yale legend in his sophomore season of 1929. Albie Booth will forever be known as Little Boy Blue.
I played on Albie's team, and while he got out of the boys club and came to Yale, I took his place at the boys club. So Albie and I were buddies. But that Army game when he went in the second quarter and Army was leading 13-0, and then Albie went in, of course he made three big runs of 67, 75, and 47, I think, and kicked the three extra points drop kicking. So we beat Army that day, or they beat Army that day, 21-13. 144 pounds of dynamite.
Albie Booth completed his distinguished career at Yale as captain of the 1931 team. In his final game, Booth drop-kicked the winning field goal for the only points as Yale beat Harvard 3-0. But an even bigger treat was in store for New Haven.
That treat came in 1934 when Ducky Pond took over as coach and was greeted by the other two superb athletes of the 30s who would gain a prominent place in Yale lore as they dominated college football. They were in Larry Kelly from New Jersey and halfback Clint Frank from suburban Chicago.
Ducky maintained the tradition of an alumni coaching situation.
Ducky Pond, of course, was our head coach, and he was a superb coach. So I think Yale football measured up to any place in the country at that time.
The Princeton game, this one single score against overwhelming odds. Odds were quoted at 5-1 and 35 points, and it was quite an upset. It was quoted the upset of the year, as a matter of fact.
Larry Kelly seized the headlines for the first time as a sophomore in 1934 when he stepped up at Princeton with a truly inspired play.
And I went over the middle, and the halfback went outside. He was supposed to hit the halfback, but habit overcame instruction, and he threw it down the middle, and that was the ballgame.
That touchdown held up as Yale's Iron Man 11, playing without substitution, had to withstand a Tiger surge at the goal line to defend their 7-0 lead.
They were on the goal line a couple of times, and one way or another, we managed to avert the score.
That was the beginning, but the big year for Larry Kelly was when he was joined the following season on the varsity by his passing partner, Clint Frank.
Kelly was an asset to anybody in the backfield who was considering throwing a pass because he was a great receiver.
He was a marvelous football player. He could do anything. He didn't have to kick because we had an outstanding kicker, but he passed and ran the ball and had all the confidence in the world in him.
Clint Frank combined with Kelly to give Yale and Coach Pond the two best football players in the country on the same team. The 1936 Elis were ranked 12th, beating everyone except Colonel Red Blake's Dartmouth Indians. Yale was trailing Navy 7-6 in Game 3 when Kelly's alert thinking saved the day. He would kick the fumbled ball downfield, improving the field position and setting up the winning touchdown in a 12-7 Bulldog triumph as Navy protested in vain. Larry Kelly's ingenuity forced a rules change that no longer allows a player to advance a ball in this manner, in fact, penalizing him for illegally kicking the ball.
Eli's everywhere got a boot out of the play of their double-threat twins in 1936, Larry Kelly's Heisman Trophy season. The game that defined the 1936 season and established Kelly's Heisman credentials was the first leg of the Big Three series, November 14th at Princeton's Palmer Stadium.
Yeah, we were behind at one point 16-0.
Frank gave Yale life, scoring just before halftime to make it 16-7. After Al Hesberg's 20-yard touchdown cut the margin to 16-14, Frank and Kelly went to work.
Clint threw a long pass. I picked it up.
And Kelly caught it, as he caught almost everything.
And Jack White was coming over, the safety back. He went over backwards and landed on his head. And I think it was that broke his jaw.
I was told, and I think it's authenticated, he broke his jaw on the stiff arm.
That's where the famous stiff arm occurred. And anyway, we got the touchdown.
But Kelly's jaw-breaking stiff arm did not knock the fight out of the Princeton Tiger. Princeton had retaken the lead 23-20 in the fourth quarter, and Yale was pinned back on its 5 when Kelly and Frank clicked again.
I did throw a pass to Kelly that he caught.
But this time I didn't get away with it. There were too many Princeton boys around. They ganged up.
The march ended as Frank took it in at the corner to give Yale a 26-23 victory for leg 1 of the Big Three title.
Big Three bragging rights were on the line as they had been many times before, making the 55th meeting between Yale and Harvard an especially spirited contest, and it was a battle to the finish. The winner came on Frank's second quarter touchdown pass to Kelly to put the Bulldogs on top 14-0. The Elis held on to win 14-13. And Larry Kelly had finished his career as the second ever winner of the Heisman Trophy.
They didn't have the wide acceptance that it has now, or the recognition. And of course, I grow with the expanding horizon of the trophy, and it becomes more, I get more requests for fan mail now than I did 25 years ago.
Kelly also enjoys the singular distinction of being the only player to score at least one touchdown in every Big Three game in 3 years of play.
With Kelly and 7 other starters gone, Yale relied on the senior leadership of Clint Frank in 1937. Clint's inspirational play led his teammates through the schedule, stalled only by a 9-9 tie with Dartmouth. Clint Frank had perhaps his finest individual afternoon in the home finale at the Yale Bowl, scoring all 4 touchdowns as the Elis shut out Princeton in the mud 26-0.
Well, it was another one of those rainy days, pouring rain, and got the kickoff, and on the first play I went 70 yards or so for a touchdown. I can't recall the other ones. I do recall it was so rainy and so wet. There were probably 30,000 people there. That I remember Dave Caldwell, our kicker, said that on the point after touchdown, he said, instead of doing this, he said, I'd like to punt this ball right out of the park.
Frank had severely injured a knee late in the Princeton game, but with Harvard next and both teams unbeaten and once tied, Clint knew he must play.
It was bad for a knee. The whole ligaments were torn, cartilage was torn. Subsequently went and I had it operated and removed the following year.
Playing bravely on that damaged knee, Frank tied it at 6 apiece in the third quarter.
It was painful, but a lot of other people have played with pain.
Yale did its best to stop the Crimson, but despite Frank's heroic defensive efforts, Harvard won it 13-6. Yale's 1936 season may have ended in a loss against its biggest rival, but Clint Frank came home with the big statue to give Yale back-to-back Heisman Trophy winners.
Yale fortunes plunged after the double Heisman era with 4 straight losing seasons.
Order was restored to the New Haven Universe in 1942 under the leadership of All-America center Spence Mosley. The 173-pound Mosley led the Elis to a 5-3-1 season, the first Big Three sweep since the Kelly-Frank team of 1936.
The Elis were on the move, thanks to the brilliant play of Townsend Tim Hoops, who put the Bulldogs up 6-0 on this outstanding run. Then, late in the game, Mosley led the way for Bob Pickett's charge through the Tiger defense to give Yale a 13-6 victory.
Winning the Big Three was on the line the following week at the Yale Bowl. But it looked bad for the Elis as Harvard led 3-0 with 5 minutes to go when Hugh Knowlton found Hoops. Hoops went all the way, 61 yards for the 7-3 victory and Big Three honors for the Elis, the last important victory for the duration of the Second World War.
After Pearl Harbor, Yale and many other campuses abruptly shifted to a wartime mode, training officers for what ultimately would be a more important team effort. Yale and Harvard did not square off again until the end of World War II in 1945. And with veterans like Fritz Barzalauskas returning and the Yale's first black player, Levi Jackson, on board, Yale was ready to sparkle. The Bulldogs had lost only once with a tie. Harvard was also once beaten as the two teams faced each other in Boston.
Until that time, in the long history of the series, the team scoring first had never lost the game. So it looked grim for Yale when Harvard's Chip Gannon led the Crimson to a 14-0 lead after one quarter. And Jackson, the outstanding freshman, got Yale moving with an option pass hitting Art Fitzgerald for the score to put Yale on the board. The Elis, trailing 14-6 late in the second quarter, cut the Harvard lead to 14-13 on this 9-yard run by Ferd the Bull Nadherney. Then Yale took control in the second half, scoring 2 more touchdowns to salt away the victory. Quarterback Tex First put it away for good on this scoring pass to Jack Roderick to clinch a 27-14 win. Yale ended the 1946 season ranked 12th in the country.
Yale went to West Point and came back with the ever-entertaining 310-pound Herman Hickman. Herman Hickman was a raconteur without peer, but as coach, his best team was in 1950. They went 6-3. After just 2 victories in 1951, Herman Hickman abruptly quit just 4 years after coming to Yale.
When he resigned his position as head coach, he was asked why, and he said, well, when you're being run out of town by a mob, with a lynch rope, the best thing to do is to get in front and make believe you're leading the mob.
And Yale had kind of a sort of a comedic reality during the Hickman years, just before Jordan Oliver stepped in there.
Jordan Oliver had joined the staff in early 1952.
Jordan Oliver was a real gentleman. I guess I would call him sort of the prototype of the gentle giant. He was a big man, had big hands, a lot of stature, and he never yelled.
Oliver wasted no time installing his system. He was a stickler for the fundamentals.
Get as fancy as you want to if you have the time to work on all that kind of stuff, but don't ever forget the basics, and he was a great advocate of that.
Oliver's 1952 team had lost to Navy and Princeton, but the coach had his Bulldogs ready to invade Harvard Stadium. The game turned into a rout when Woodsom's 11th TD catch of the year made it 40-7.
They put in the manager, who was Charlie Yeager, who was, I would say, probably 5 feet 4 or 5 inches. Frank Smith, who had normally played right end, was about 6'4", and I looked out and there was nobody in the huddle where he used to be. And then I looked down about a foot, and there, sure enough, there was another hand. That was Charlie. And Charlie was hit by some big Harvard lineman, spun almost completely around. His helmet dropped down. I mean, I don't know how he get out there without falling down, and how he caught the ball with his helmet so low in his head. I did not really think so much about we were trying to stick it to Harvard. It was a kid that always would want to get into a football game, was the way I looked at it. And it wasn't until the next day when then I realized that that was taken badly by the Harvard fans, and I can understand why.
Jordan Oliver's teams played smart and they played hard. Elis everywhere will always cherish that afternoon of November 5th, 1955, when Army came to Yale Bowl for the last meeting with the Bulldogs for 30 years.
It was just one of those things that's where the pitch began to get heavier and heavier and heavier. And, with 73,000 people in that bowl, the place was going crazy.
Trailing 6-0 in the second quarter, Yale's chance came when Captain Phil Tarasovic recovered at the Army 10.
We were in the ball game when Phil got the ball, and Phil came to play too.
Quarterback Dean Laux seized the moment. Laux connected with Paul Lopata for the tying touchdown. Dick Winterbauer's critical extra point gave Yale a 7-6 lead.
And it sort of set the tone for the rest of the game, and I think what we told them was, look, guys, we're here to play, and we can play against these guys.
Then in the fourth quarter, Denny McGill and Al Ward led Yale down the field on the ground. Ward punched it over to make it 14-6 Yale. Yale enjoyed one of its greatest victories ever. The 14-12 victory left a wake-up call to America that the Ivy League was alive and well as it prepared to enter a new era.
That new era actually had been born with the President's Agreement of 1954. The agreement established a formal creation of the Ivy League in 1956 with the strictest standards in intercollegiate athletics.
Here is the basis for the agreement. Academic control of athletics, no spring football practice or postseason play, all aid based strictly on need, in other words, no athletic scholarships, and the 8 schools must play each other in a round-robin schedule.
Every student is accepted on their academic credentials, and aid is given strictly on need of the family. There are no athletic or academic scholarships in our league. And it's a very tedious job. Recruiting in our league, I believe it's tougher than any league in the country.
It certainly is not a training ground to get people ready for the pros in any sport, and I think most of the kids who come here realize that.
Yale is still and was then and always has been one of the top colleges in the country, and I wanted to get a good education, as good as I could get. In case something did happen football-wise, I'd always have a Yale degree, which I'm to this day grateful for, believe me.
I went to Yale for an education. That's why my father sent me and paid the way, paid the freight. But the idea was to get an education. Along with it, I got some notoriety from football.
They know they can get the best, we feel, the best of both worlds. Certainly get the top education in the country, and yet play pretty good football. And if they so desire and they have the capabilities, they can go on to professional sports. I believe I've had 25 in the years I've been here.
Right. I think that no one said it any better than Bob Giamatti when he was president. He looked upon athletics as an important part of the education process, and unique in that it stretched, as he put it, it stretches the human spirit as nothing else can, and I think he's absolutely right.
It was fitting in 1956, as Ivy League play began, that Yale, the school that had led development of the sport, became the first official Ivy League champion. Al Ward signaled that Jordan Olivar had an outstanding team in Game 3 at Columbia when he took off on a 73-yard scoring run to key a 33-19 Yale victory.
A non-league loss to Colgate spoiled an unbeaten season, but did not derail Yale's mission. The Bulldogs got back on track at Dartmouth on November the 3rd, thanks to this 93-yard run by Denny McGill, the longest in Yale history.
Denny was one of those people that none of us ever believed. I mean, we believed he was invincible, and he kept proving it every game.
Princeton, as always, was the first Big Three hurdle for 1956. The Tigers had won in 55, and Yale was seeking a payback.
When we came back against Princeton that senior year, there was no way we were going to get beat.
Dean Laux was ready, hitting McGill on a perfect pass to get the Elis off and running to a 42-20 win. The Bulldogs were ready to now march on to Boston, seeking a Big Three title for the first time in 10 years.
The 1956 edition of The Game broke open in the second quarter. Yale already was leading 7-0 when Denny McGill got loose. McGill went the distance, 78 yards for the score, to make it 14-0 Bulldogs. Then, after Harvard got on the board, Al Ward answered on the ensuing kickoff, going 77 yards for the touchdown. Yale beat Harvard 42-24 for not only the Big Three, but the special distinction of being the first ever Ivy League champions.
We won the Ivy League the first year, and I think we thought we were pretty good and probably could take on some of the other teams in the country, and maybe we could have, I don't know.
No one can pinpoint the date, but sometime during the 50s, another American custom arose, one that found an ideal place in the college football setting. It was called tailgating.
Tailgating certainly is part of the football tradition, but it never is the most important order of business. There is that matter of the game and the players who remain the core of the experience. So it was in the fall of 1957 when a group of bullpups, including myself, assembled on campus. Our years at Yale would run the gamut of extremes from tempering defeat as sophomores to total victory as seniors.
We were working hard, playing hard, and we weren't winning any games. In fact, I think we're the only team that didn't win an Ivy League game, ever.
It was probably the lowest point in everybody's personal college career.
The Bulldogs improved to 6-3 in 1959, and then came that glorious season of 1960. Yale's fourth unbeaten, untied team of the 20th century really showed its stuff in Game 5 against Colgate.
And everything just turned around and started clicking. And I would say that we really, our confidence came in shortly after the Colgate game, and we just felt like everything was going to work for us.
Fullback Bob Blanchard had his best day ever. With Colgate driving, Blanchard struck with the longest interception return in school history.
And the guy chucked a pass in desperation, and I ended up taking it all the way down the field. It happens that in the Brown game, Kenny Wolf, who was one of our fine running backs, took a kickoff on the opening play of the game and went all the way, and I had knocked a guy down illegally, and it got called back. And Kenny says on that interception of mine, he tried to knock a guy down, but he tried to clip a guy from Colgate, but he turned around on him.
Yale was on its way to the unbeaten season. Outstanding play in the line and the backfield on defense keyed this exceptional year. Absolutely everything worked.
And I can remember fooling around in the day before the game and a couple days before, running plays backwards like you did on reruns of films. And I don't know why we did it. Princeton was a game we looked forward to. And we were taught by the coaches not to look too far forward, but in the back of our minds, Princeton was the game.
And the senior-dominated Eli's were ready. Princeton came into the bowl unbeaten, but the Tigers soon had their noses rubbed in the kitty litter as Yale grabbed a 2-touchdown lead and maintained the pressure. Kenny Wolf was on the receiving end of a pair of Tom Singleton touchdown passes as the Eli seniors played their last of 8 straight home games, winning in grand style, 43-22, 8-0 and 1 to go.
The perfect season would have to come in the only game on the road, the game at Harvard. And the class of '61 had never beaten the Crimson from freshman year on. We won the coin toss for the first time that year, but instead of taking the ball, we elected to take the wind instead. Yet, we scored first as we had in every 1960 game.
Ironically, it was the same first play we used against Penn. Harvard had not, in those days you were allowed to see one film of the opposing team's games. Maybe it was 2. They did not see the film of that game, and they didn't pick it up. So we ran the exact same play against Harvard.
The Crimson bought Singleton's belly fake to Blanchard, and Wolf sprinted untouched 41 yards for a touchdown to make it 6-0.
If you diagrammed that play on the blackboard and told everybody to block their man, and then you watched the film, everybody blocked the person they were supposed to do.
The Bulldogs got a gift on John Hutcherson's alert interception of Harvard quarterback Charlie Ravenel's errant pitch-out and a 45-yard run back to stake the Eli's to a 17-0 halftime lead.
Yale rolled on to a 39-6 victory to cap the perfect season for themselves, Coach Olivar, and the school. The 1960 team may not have too many records still standing in the books, but remember, this was single platoon football, and the first 11 averaged playing only 37 minutes a game, splitting time between offense and defense.
Well, it was pandemonium afterwards. Everybody came down on the field. I remember we had Coach Oliver up on our shoulders, and our families were out on the field. Our friends from the student body were out on the field, and we slowly moved as a group over towards the field house where we hung out for a long time.
I don't think it's the season per se of being undefeated. It was the relationships that we had established with the players, with our friends. And it's similar to the relationships that you establish at a university like Yale. But we really grew to be a very strong group. And we've had reunions since then of just the football guys. The memories are the fun we had as players, the wins and the losses, and we just had a reunion this summer, a 30th reunion of our team.
Tom is right. The development of our team from an 11-8 win over Connecticut to the blowout against Harvard was an incredible growing experience. But the best experience was yet to come. The outflow of notes, letters, phone calls from Yale alumni all around the world was really great. It was that experience that made us feel really important in the great Yale football tradition.
Well, I'm afraid our years at Yale were a little less distinguished than Mike's. As a matter of fact, we thought we were a transition between the eras of Pyle, Baum, and Singleton, and Hill, Dowling, and Weinstein. We were one of Yale's last traditional classes. Our first ceremony was watching the coronation of Kingman Brewster. Back in those days, you still had to wear a coat and tie to meals, and co-education in the Vietnam War were still years away, at least in our minds. Our only real concern back then was playing for a brand new coach. Jordan Olivar resigned in January of 1963. His replacement came from Miami of Ohio. John Pont brought his staff with him, and his top assistant was his college roommate, close friend, and backfield coach, a man named Carmen Koza.
The game was played at Yale Bowl, producing the only Eli victory in that series between 1960 and 1967. Randy Egloff and Chuck Mersine did the job for the Elis, leading the way in a methodical 20-6 win, John Pont's biggest win at Yale. He left Yale for Indiana after the 1964 season, forcing another coaching search. Athletic Director Delaney Kippeth wisely stayed at home, finding the right man in Carm Koza.
And that very week, I was offered the New Hampshire job, and I was ready to take it. I knew I wouldn't be going on to Indiana. And Delaney Kippeth, who was then the athletic director, said, why don't you just hold on a couple days? And within a week, they appointed me the head coach here. So I guess I was in the right place at the right time. The best thing I did my first year at Yale is recruit Brian Dowling and Calvin Hill and people like that. They were my first freshman class.
We hit it off immediately, Carm also being from the Cleveland area.
I can recall when Brian visited our campus, my old coach at Ohio State, Woody Hayes, called me that weekend and said, Carm, there's a pretty good athlete you have on your campus. I hope you get him. He knew that Ohio State wasn't going to get him, and he was concerned that he might go to Michigan. And to make a long story short, we did get him, and obviously that was the greatest find at a quarterback position that any coach could possibly have.
The other big playman in Koza's first class came from Baltimore via Riverdale Prep, Calvin Hill.
Yale satisfied my my desire to play in front of large crowds. It had a wonderful football tradition. It was a great school academically. I was close to New York City. I liked that. So I think all of those things played in.
And I really don't know all the reasons why he chose Yale, but I'm sure glad he did.
And Yale had never had a black quarterback. And so that was one of the very important reasons why I chose Yale. I was going to be their first black quarterback. That lasted about 2 days, my freshman year.
So what we did with Calvin is we put him at the tailback spot, and his senior year, he accounted for 12 either touchdowns or two-point conversions. So I was just so impressed with their talent, and the things that they could do was just amazing.
Brian Dowling was hurt most of his sophomore season, but everything gelled in 1967. The Elis routed Dartmouth 56-15, with Dowling applying the exclamation point on this 30-yard keeper for a touchdown.
Then came Princeton. Yale had not beaten the Tigers since 1960, but a trick play opened the gates when Hill on the pitch-out pass to Dowling to key a 29-7 romp.
2 years after the fact, I finally had a chance to throw the ball, and I think I reminded Brian when we got to the sidelines. I said, that was really the way it was all supposed to be. I was supposed to be throwing to you.
In order to complete an unbeaten Ivy League season, Yale had a score to settle with Harvard, who had beaten the Blue the last 3 games. After the Crimson overcame a 17-0 deficit to go up 20-17, Dowling pulled out the victory in true Frank Merriwell fashion.
Brian rolled to his right and slipped and threw the ball to Del Marting and scored a winning touchdown against Harvard to give us the championship in '67.
The 1968 Elis literally ran through their first 8 opponents in defense of the Ivy League title. Calvin Hill was exceptional, showing the moves that would make him a professional star with the Dallas Cowboys.
But he was a great athlete. A lot of people said, well, you know, he wasn't in the OJ class, which was also our year. But because of me, he didn't run the ball 25 times a game. I think the most he ever ran was 14 or 15, and I think he only gained 100 yards 1 time. But he was such a great receiver, and his average yards per catch was something like 25. I never played anybody that got open better when the quarterback scrambled. So he was just an incredible athlete, and plus he threw me a couple of touchdown passes. So he had it was a lot of fun to play with him.
If ever anybody could be unaffected by the renown that he's enjoyed, it's Brian.
The team was the talk of the campus, providing much of the material for cartoonist Gary Trudeau, whose bull tales in the Yale Daily led to his Pulitzer Prize-winning strip Doonesbury. One such character was Calvin.
He started out with the Yale football team around the huddle, and I was one of his characters.
Many of Trudeau's Yale characters made the transition to Doonesbury, where they remain today, especially a quarterback called BD.
I think because the football team was doing well, he could kid more and get, it was a great following. I know the football team grabbed the Yale Daily and ripped for his column or his strip every day, and so they really liked it. I think, had we been 0-9 each year, they might have not appreciated it as much.
The student body just was in awe of this team. There were spontaneous pep rallies starting every day. No matter where I was, I'd almost have to come out and cheer with the kids. It was just an incredible thing. I thought they were going to tip our bus over when we went on to Princeton. It was just an incredible era.
The thing that was very exciting for all of us was the spontaneity of pep rallies, which are very un-Ivy-like. And with the combination with the comic strip sort of poking fun at our success, it sort of galvanized all the parts of the university to come out on Saturday and watch us. But it was a challenge because we were #1 and everybody was shooting for us, and that just gave us that type of incentive to do as best we could.
I mean, there were people who said that there were only 2 people important at Yale, and that was God and Brian Dowling.
So we ended up leading the nation in consecutive wins. I believe we had 16. They averaged like 456 yards a ball game. They scored in 22 consecutive quarters, and in all honesty, they didn't play very much in the second half. That ended with that infamous tie up at Cambridge in 1968 with that 29-29 tie, a game I'd like to forget.
It was a fascinating game. We were both teams were undefeated, and it was for the Ivy League championship, and we had controlled the game.
They scored 16 points in the last 42 seconds to tie. A lot of very strange occurrences had to happen for the game to end up the way it did.
They scored with 42 seconds left on the clock. They went for a 2-point conversion and scored again, and then came and kicked an onside kick and recovered with 41 seconds left on the clock, and marched down the field and scored with no time left. And so we were ahead 29-27, and they made it. It was unbelievable.
I've never heard a stadium so noisy in my life. It was just chaotic.
When the crowd was cleared from the field, Champy hit Pete Varney in the end zone for the tie that all Elis remembered to this day.
It's a game like I always felt it was played in heaven and sort of dropped on us. I don't think a game like that could ever happen again. And although, it was probably like the worst defeat I've ever had, it was a tie. And I think the players on that team had it their way so much, so easily. Maybe it brought them down to earth.
for 2 days I had actually thought they had, beaten us on the scoreboard, and that we were 8-1 or 9-1 or whatever, and they were actually 10-0. I didn't realize that, we had tied for the championship. So I felt pretty good about that. But I've always said, Harvard types tend to boast about that 29-29 tie, and they celebrate it as a victory. And in sports lore, we've always said that a tie is like kissing your sister. And I've always felt that the fact that Harvard types celebrate a tie in that manner just substantiates something I've always felt about the essential Harvard character, or lack of character.
But the excellence did not end with the graduation of the Dollings and Hills. Another great Yale player emerged in the early 70s. This was Dick Geron, who became Yale's career rushing leader, gaining just under 3,000 yards. Geron's 27 touchdowns set the standard, and Dick went on to a successful career as a player and assistant coach in the National Football League.
Like I told our alumni, you could be in a phone booth with him for 20 minutes and never touch him. He was so elusive. He started the 70s for us. He played in the East-West Shrine game. He became my first and only first-team Kodak All-American. And then I think that attracted more good talent.
A marquee player for Yale from 1973 to 75 was Gary Fensick.
Gary Fensick was one of a kind in his time. He was so competitive, played hurt. He was the type of guy that never wanted to come off the field. So I put him back on punts and kickoffs. We tired him out, so he just couldn't complain about not playing enough football at Yale.
The Ivy League had a little different appeal, and I looked at 3 schools. I looked at Harvard, and I looked at Dartmouth, and looked at Yale first, and just fell in love with Yale. And I have a 97-yard reception that was one of the strangest calls that Carm Koza probably ever made. We were in our end zone on the 3-yard line, and he called a halfback option pass. And Don Gazicki was our halfback, and I think we both looked at one another and go, now? And he threw the ball, I caught it, and the DBs hit one another as they dove for me, and knocked one another off the tackle, and I chugged my way down there. I'll tell you, that's a long way to run. With a mouth guard, I came into that end zone, I was dying.
During Fensick's 3 years, Yale went 21-6. Fensick, later an all-pro safety in a 12-year career with the Chicago Bears, made a sacrifice for the good of the Yale team, playing out of position at wide receiver.
He was a defensive back on the freshman team, and there was no doubt that he would be a great defensive back. Well, we ran the wishbone in those days, and he was a wideout. And I tell you, he just went downfield and just about killed defensive backs. He would go up in the stands to get a defensive back. So there was no doubt about his competitiveness, but he had everything else to go with it, too. And he caught some passes that I just don't know to this day how he caught them.
I think giving is always better than receiving. But I did play both ways my freshman year, and then they just felt I was more valuable on offense. Now, I played with some really fun players, and I shared time my sophomore year with a really super guy. And you wish when you're a wide receiver that you could get the ball every single play. And there were a couple games where they threw the ball an awful lot, but that's not really the type of balanced offense that Yale's known for.
Another outstanding student athlete in the mid-70s was John Pagliaro. Pagliaro came into his own in 1976, scoring 16 touchdowns. He added 14 more in 77 while gaining more than 1,000 yards each year. John is Yale's touchdown leader with 34.
John Pagliaro was a tough, hard-nosed running back right here from Derby, Connecticut, who had the highest knee action, I think, of any back I'd had in all the years I'd been here, and I always felt his heart was bigger than his body. He was the type of young man that just didn't like to go down, and those are the kind of backs every coach wants to coach.
Leading the way in 1978 was tight end John Spagnola, a future star with the Philadelphia Eagles.
John Spagnola was an incredible athlete. He loved to catch the football. But in all fairness to him, he was a fine blocker, especially his senior year. He has one of the longest pass plays in Yale's history. We called it downtown left. It was a quarterback just threw the ball out to him in the flat as a lateral, then he threw it down to the tight end, Bob Christianak, in a Harvard game to help us win that game. And he had such a wonderful way about him. He was a real personality. But the thing I liked about John is when you teed it up, he was really there and could do a great job for you.
Spagnola and his class of '79 teammates enjoyed a significant achievement. In their 4 years at Yale, including freshman year, this class never lost to Harvard. The '79 class was succeeded by teams who had an amazing run through the Ivy League, winning 3 straight titles.
It was evident 1981 would be a special season by Game 3 when Yale beat Navy 23-19 on national television.
The '81 season really was probably the most fun that I've ever had on a football field because we had such bonds between the players.
As the season progressed, the team continued its romp through the Ivy League.
And we were up against Boston College. There's Kevin Zinger playing middle guard at 170 pounds. He whipped their tails all day long. He was in their backfield because he was so quick. And I remember after the game reading in a newspaper report that the BC coach said that Kevin Zinger was the type of guy who could wrestle alligators.
The '81 Bulldogs were unbeaten after 8 games heading into Princeton. That afternoon at Palmer Stadium, Rich Diana had the most productive day of any runner in Yale history, gaining 222 yards.
Well, I guess if they give the ball to anybody enough times, they'll gain 200. And that particular day, we were really grinding it out on the ground, and it was a bit of a wet day, so it was kind of difficult for us to throw. It wasn't very difficult for them to throw because I think they threw for 500 yards that day.
But boom turned to gloom as Princeton upset the Elis 35-31 in the final minutes to spoil the unbeaten dream. But with Harvard next, there was no time to linger over that tough loss.
The game took on additional significance. Larry Kelly and Clint Frank donated their Heisman trophies to the school in a pregame ceremony.
That was such a wonderful situation. We had the bowl completely filled. I mean, there were 75,000 people there, and it was the last play of the first half. And we were about at the 40-yard line of Harvard. And John Rogan, we called a little screen pass over to the side, and Rogan hit me on a screen pass, and I got a good block downfield from someone and took it in from about the 40-yard line. And I can remember running through the end zone and catapulting myself up into the air, and I have this wonderful picture from the backside showing me jumping in the air with the ball up high, and every fan in the entire stadium standing on his or her feet, just with a joyous smile and a hand up in the air in exultation. It's such a wonderful feeling.
That 1981 win over Harvard rang down the curtain on a brilliant Yale run. Their legacy is 3 straight Ivy League titles and 25 wins against only 4 losses.
From 1985 through '87, Kelly Ryan took his place in the Yale record book, completing 348 passes, 112 of them to all-time Eli receiver Dean Athanasia.
1989 was a special season for Yale football, Carm Koza's 25th year as head coach. His Bulldogs came through with the best silver anniversary present they could give him, his 10th Ivy League title. The title clincher over Princeton was win number 150 at Yale for Coach Koza.
The grand finale for the 1989 season came at the Waldorf Astoria in New York on January 31st, 1990. It was the silver anniversary dinner honoring the coach. Players from each of his Yale teams attended, 19 captains in person.
I propose a toast to Carm Koza the winningest coach in the history of Yale University. As Mae West said, too much of a good thing is wonderful.
One of my favorite sayings is a Middle Eastern proverb. And whenever I think of it, I think of Carmen Koza. And it goes like this: an army of deer led by a lion will defeat an army of lions led by a deer.
Some 27 years ago, Gene and I got in an automobile with 3 small girls and started east to Connecticut. I had never been east of Pittsburgh. I was a little disappointed because I was not afforded the opportunity to become the head football coach at Miami University. A good friend of mine by the name of Bo got it. But I outlasted the son of a gun.
The one special event in the school year that unites everyone associated with Yale football comes on the last weekend of the football season, the meeting with Harvard, the game.
I realize, though, the longer I'm in this business, especially in this game, that it's probably the most meaningful game for the seniors. It's more than likely the last time they'll put a uniform on. It's the game that they're going to remember because of the fact that these are 2 great schools competing on the field. Right on the program it says the game, like there's no other game being played in the country. It's an unbelievable event. It's a game that I feel all schools should have an opportunity to take part in, because it's really what college football is all about.
It's just the culmination of 2 great institutions, and it's, they compete in every area of academics and athletics. 2 schools that have been in existence for over 250 years.
Another apparent tradition of the game is playing the Yale-Harvard freshman game in the mud to kick off the weekend.
Well, it always seems to rain the day before the Harvard game. I remember my freshman year, I think it did, and it just seems to.
As stormy as Friday had been, Saturday was superb.
Then it was time. The 108th meeting in 1991 may not have been for the Ivy League title, but victory for either side would mean a winning season, and it would be a tremendous matter of pride. 1991's heroes would bear names like Captain Chris Corey, quarterback Nick Crawford, running back Jim Govea, and the other 90 student athletes on the Yale squad.
The sun was breaking through the overcast as Yale's Corey surpassed the 1,000-yard mark for the season, scoring the game's first touchdown to key a 10-0 Eli lead after 1 period. A pair of Mark Hall field goals sent Harvard in at halftime with a 13-10 lead. As the 4th quarter opened, Yale took control of the game.
The Bulldogs had prevailed 23-13, and as it had 58 other times, the victory made for a successful Yale season. 1991's 6 victories left Carm Koza with 162 in his career at Yale, far and away the most coaching wins ever at New Haven.
These fans are not only cheering the Yale football team as they have over the many years, they are celebrating a great tradition at one of America's finest universities.
I'm very glad I went there. I'm very glad that I'm a graduate of that school, and I'm proud to be a graduate of that school.
Yale means linking in with all those great Yale traditions and being a part of that and being accepted in that. And it's a very special kind of experience, and I'm very happy I chose Yale.
I look back on the coaching and the experience at Yale and say that They taught me a lot of things, and most of all, they taught me to keep my nose pointed towards my goals and to persevere through hard times.
When I was in school, of course, I met some very fine and prominent Yale people who had been successful in business, politics, and in every other endeavor. And others have followed. It's given me an opportunity to meet many of those people and know them well, and I pride them as my great friends.
The camaraderie was probably the greatest thing. And coming back and seeing people from other classes and talking about the whole experience and how much it meant to them in their lives.
I've enjoyed seeing the new generations of youngsters that are applying to Yale, and I think the athletic feelings are still there, the same. The football's a wonderful experience.
Well, I wouldn't give up my Yale experience for anything. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And it still is and always will be.
The Yale experience, I don't think it's in terms of getting a great job or anything else. I think it's really just kind of having the opportunity to investigate everything. I mean, whether you're out drinking a beer or in a classroom, you're always investigating the moral side of your life, questions about everything, because you're in such a stimulating environment that you come away, I think, feeling confirmed in terms of what your values are, what's important to you, and hopefully being very open and tolerant to new ideas. I mean, that's what a liberal education should be.
It begins to form this notion of team, this notion of dependence on other people, which makes a team successful. You can't live without it. You cannot be successful without it. And when you get into corporate life, I think any walk of life, you can't help but be impressed with how dependent you are on others and the ability to motivate others to work in the same direction. This is what football is all about. This is what business is all about. This is what success is all about.
Well, Tim, listening to Vern Laux and all those other Yale football greats, I think that just about says it all.
You're right, Mike. I frankly feel a little sheepish tossing my reflections amongst the eloquence of the all-time greats, so I'll only say I've had a number of proud achievements in my life, but I don't think there are any prouder than my allegiance to Yale football.
I can't agree with you more, Tim, and here's to at least 700 more victories.
We are little black sheep.